Charlie Goodnight, the father of the Texas Panhandle and one tough son of a bitch, although I doubt anyone ever called him that to his face. To quote Larry McMurtry's book, Streets of Laredo, bullets had killed men fighting at his very elbow, but no bullets had ever struck him. He had taken herds almost 100 waterless miles and had not starved. He had raced to turn stampedes in pitch darkness over broken country on unreliable horses and had not once fallen or been thrown. He had been in numerous barrooms and other crowded situations with outlaws who would shoot you if they didn't like the way you removed your hat. Yet he had removed his hat pretty much as he pleased and had never been shot. One of the real-life inspirations behind Lonesome Dove's Captain Woodrow F. Call, Charlie got his start early as a scout for the Texas Rangers, chasing down Comanche and Kiowa hostiles, as well as his fair share of salty horse thieves and bandits. He went on to blaze famous cattle trails, invent the Chuck Wagon, worked to preserve what was left of the great southern herd of American Bison, was the first to graze cattle in the great Palo Duro Canyon, as well as the first to utilize barbed wire in northern Texas. Sometimes he was rich and sometimes he was broke, but he was always a man of vision and quiet determination. So come on in, take your pants off. Let's dim the lights and make awkward eye contact while telling ourselves this is totally not weird as we discuss the life and times of Charlie Goodnight in this newest, I guess Toby Keith was right after all, maybe I should have been a cowboy, episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. The day Charles Goodnight was brought into this world on March 5th, 1836, in Macoupin County, Illinois, a little under 200 brave men were enjoying their last day among the living in a little fort down in Tejas called the Alamo. Charlie would later take pride in the fact that he was born in the same year that the Republic of Texas was formed, a state that it seemed he was almost destined to become a part of. He'd also take pride in the fact that he joined Texas in the same year that Texas joined the Union, in late 1845. Charlie's dad, also named Charles, middle name Fox Wing, not kidding, how cool of a name is that? There's no way in hell I'd go by the name Charles if I had a badass middle name like Fox Wing. Anyway, unfortunately, Fox Wing passed away from pneumonia when Charlie was just 4 years old. His mom, Charlotte, soon remarried to a neighboring farmer named Hiram Doherty, and it was with his stepdad that the family made the 800-mile move to Texas in 1845. Charlie riding his horse named Blaze the entire way, bareback. And for all you dirty-minded people, bareback means riding a horse without a saddle, okay? It does not mean boning little Miss Sally Rottencrotch without a condom. So let's just not go there, all right? Let's try to class it up and act like adults for once. Anyway, the family settled in Milam County, Texas, near a place called Nashville on the Brazos. I had previously never heard of Nashville on the Brazos, so I Googled it. Actually, I DuckDuckGo'd it, because I don't like Google spying on me. Turns out Nashville was actually up for consideration for the Texas capital at one point, but got passed over. And then it got passed over by the railroad. And then it just passed. Nashville on the Brazos is just a ghost town now. But in 1845, when 9-year-old Charlie Goodnight arrived, it was a bustling community. It was also where Goodnight received an education. And I don't mean a formal education. You know, he only got around 6 months worth of school in his entire life. I mean an education on the frontier ways. He befriended a local Native American by the name of Cadeau Jake that taught him how to hunt and track there in that Brazos River bottom. And I'm sure he learned quite a bit more from Cadeau Jake. I'm sure he was able to pick up a little bit when it came to Native American mannerisms, their way of talking, their way of doing business, observations and insights that would prove invaluable in a few years when he began dealing with Comanche and Kiowa. Young Charlie soon started hiring himself out to nearby farms and plantations, and at the age of 15 landed himself a job as a jockey racing horses in Port Sullivan. Port Sullivan, by the way, just like Nashville on the Brazos, is now a ghost town. So, why did 11-year-old Charles Goodnight hire himself out to nearby farms instead of working on the family farm? Wasn't his stepdad Hiram a farmer, Josh? Well, yeah, he was. But the fact that he was sleeping with Charlie's 16-year-old sister kind of put a little hitch in the family life there at home. Yeah, you heard me. Charlie's mom and Hiram had 2 children together, and she was pregnant with a third by late 1846 when the family was already in Texas. Keep in mind that Charlie had 4 other siblings before Hiram ever came into the picture. One of them was his older sister, Mary Jane. And it was while pregnant with her 8th child that Charlotte discovered her husband and 16-year-old daughter, Mary Jane, were having an illicit affair. After they got found out, Hiram and Mary Jane took Charlotte and Hiram's 2 youngest children and hauled ass to a neighboring county. Soon thereafter, Charlotte gave birth to a little baby girl named Lucinda, who Charlie became very protective of, even to the point of constructing a hiding spot deep in the woods to whisk Lucinda to in case that asshole Hiram ever came back for her. So yeah, your no-good stepdad and no-good sister start fucking and run off and leave you, your mom, a newborn baby, and 4 other kids to fend for yourselves. Hell yeah, Charlie started hiring himself out. He took any and all jobs he could find to help make ends meet, up to and including supervising slave labor work crews. He eventually found himself a job hauling freight with oxen for a couple of years, and then his mom remarried again. And good for her. First husband died, second husband turned out to be a piece of shit. Hopefully the third time's the charm. Last, she never gave up or soured on the world. Her new husband had a son, Charlie's new stepbrother, named John Wesley Sheik. Ha! I got you, you son of a bitch. You thought I was going to say John Wesley Hardin, huh? Yeah, you did. No, don't be stupid. John Wesley Hardin was only a baby when Goodnight's mom married Reverend Adam Sheik, a Methodist preacher. And if there's one universal truth in this world, it's that Methodist preachers love naming their children John Wesley. Seriously, John Wesley Hardin's daddy was a Methodist preacher as well. Anyway, John Wesley Sheik and Charlie Goodnight soon started working together. At first, the plan was to strike out for California. This is the mid-1850s, so there was some major gold fever spreading throughout the nation. Like the song goes, go west, young man. Haven't you been told? California's full of whiskey, women, and gold. The pair were talked out of going to California, though, and instead convinced to start running cattle along the Brazos River. And as it would turn out, Charlie seemed to have a knack for working cattle. In 1857, when Charlie was just 21, the pair drove their cattle up the Brazos to the Keechee Valley in Palo Pinto County, to a place called Black Springs, now known as Orrin, Texas, about 30 miles northwest of Weatherford. It was there that they built a cabin, complete with a nice stone fireplace that they'd moved their parents to the following year, and they started grazing their cattle. Charlie kept working as a freighter during this time as well, hauling supplies all the way to Houston and back, but once his stepbrother got married, Charlie took over the bulk of responsibility when it came to looking after their growing herd. It was also during this time that he met his future business partner, Oliver Loving. Loving originally hailed from Kentucky and came to Texas to farm, but like Goodnight, moved to Palo Pinto County and got involved in the cattle business. By 1857, when Charlie and his brother-in-law settled in the area, Oliver was already running cattle on 1,000 acres of land. He was also driving herds all the way from Texas to Illinois via the Shawnee Trail. And despite Loving being 24 years older than Goodnight, the two would become fast friends. So right now we're talking late 1850s, early 1860s in Texas. And where Goodnight and Loving are setting up shop is right on the edge of the frontier, an area that was constantly subject to raids by Comanche and Kiowa, especially if you take into account that the settlers were so spread out. It was common to have a homestead at this time in that area where your closest neighbor was miles and miles away. More than one family was found slaughtered when neighbors went to go check on them. Their bodies mutilated and bloated in the sun, their children missing, taken as captives. To answer this seemingly never-ending threat, ranger companies were formed to make some semblance of an effort to defend their property and families. And most of these early rangers were guys just like Charlie Goodnight. Never formally trained in the military arts, but he could ride a horse, he could navigate the country without getting lost, and he had a whole hell of a lot of common sense. Goodnight joined up with local rangers under Captain Jack J.J. Cureton, where he took on the role of scout and guide. Later in life, he described what it took to become a scout, saying first, he must be a natural woodsman and have the faculty of never needing a compass except in snowstorms or darkness. So all right, there you go. It was in this capacity as scout in 1860 when a 24-year-old Charlie Goodnight discovered a trail leading to the village of Comanche chief Pita Nocona. Nocona was a highly respected leader amongst the Comanche, but he's mostly known nowadays as the husband of Cynthia Ann Parker and the father of the last of the great Comanche chiefs, Quanah Parker. Way back in 1836, when Goodnight was just a 2-month-old baby sucking at his mother's teats, the Parker clan was raided by a combined force of Comanche, Kiowa, and Quiche allies, numbering anywhere between 100 to 600 warriors. They made quick work of the Parker men and escaped with several captive women and children, one of which was 10-year-old Cynthia Ann. And one of the warriors who took part in this raid was Pita Nocona. Cynthia was lucky and got adopted into the Comanche Nation. This was a fairly common practice. If you were a grown man, you'd be killed. A young baby, likewise, would usually be killed. Grown women were usually raped and beaten into submission and then kept as slaves. But pre-adolescent children, like 10-year-old Cynthia Ann, were often adopted. One theory as to why they did this speculates that it had something to do with the high infant mortality rate among the tribes, or their declining population due to contact with Europeans. Basically, the idea being that these youngsters they'd take captive and adopt were raised fully Comanche and treated as such, thus shoring up their numbers. Others argue this, saying that they lost more warriors on raids than they made up for with the captives, and that most of the captives that were taken were used as slave labor. Either way, like I said, Cynthia Ann was one of the lucky ones. She was raised by a Comanche couple who treated her just as if she was their own flesh and blood daughter. And when she came of age, she married Pita, the man who took part in slaughtering her parents. And it was a happy marriage. Her entire life there among the Comanche was a happy one. The couple had 3 children that we know of. Quanah, of course, another son named Pecos, who sometimes went by Peanuts, and a baby daughter named Prairie Flower. And it was Pita Nocona's camp, located there on the Pease River near present-day Charlotte, Texas, that Charlie Goodnight guided a force of some 60-odd Texas Rangers, under the leadership of Captain Sol Ross. It's important to note that this was in response to a recent raid that Pita Nocona led through Parker County, ironically a county named in honor of his wife's family after their massacre, as well as other recent raids in November of 1860 in Palo Pinto County, where Goodnight resided. A neighbor of both Goodnight and Loving, a man by the name of John Brown, was ambushed, his horses and hair taken. The raiding party then hit the Sherman household. The family, mom, dad, and 2 children were at the dinner table eating when the warriors simply opened the door and strolled on in. They pulled the Shermans from their seats and took their places, eating the food that was laid out on the table. seemingly ignoring the family as they slowly crept and inched their way out the door. The warriors outside also seemed to ignore them as they quickly made their escape down the road. Until they were done eating, at least. Soon the Comanche horseman caught up with the family, grabbing Miss Sherman by her hair as Mr. Sherman tried to hide his children in the thick underbrush and then frantically running for help. As he ran, he could still hear his wife's agonizing screams. It took Sherman hours to reach a neighbor's house. He then borrowed a horse and raced to town, where a small posse of men were raised to head to the farm. Once they got there, they found that the house had been torn apart and ransacked. But there was no Miss Sherman to be found. The posse was able to track the natives easily enough, though, considering the amount of stolen horses they were herding. And that's when they found Sherman's wife, Martha. She was alive, but barely. She'd been raped multiple times, scalped, beaten, and had 2 arrows shot into her breast. She'd linger on for another 4 days until she died. Naturally enough, people started panicking and fleeing the area as fast as they could. School teacher Jonathan Hamilton wrote, "The indications are that our county will soon be depopulated." But Goodnight wasn't one of the ones that fled. He rode all night recruiting a posse of his own to pursue the hostiles. He found 8 willing souls that met the next day at the home of an old man named Isaac Lynn. Isaac Lynn had recently lost a daughter and a son-in-law to the Comanche and was now obsessed with collecting scalps. He asked anybody who was able to take a scalp to bring it to him, where he'd salt cure and roast the gruesome trophies over a fire, in hopes they wouldn't spoil. When Goodnight walked into Mr. Lynn's home, he found the old man, quote, sitting before a large log fire in the old-fashioned fireplace, with a long forked dog wood stick on which was an Indian scalp, thoroughly salted. The hair was tucked inside. As he turned it carefully over the fire, the grease oozed out of it. He looked back over his shoulder, bade me good morning, and then turned to his work of roasting the scalp. I do not think I ever saw so sad a face. Goodnight and his posse left immediately to track down Pete and Nakona and his raiders. He found the village, like I said before, and led the rangers straight to it. On the way to the village, Goodnight found a pillow slip with a little girl's belt and Martha Sherman's Bible in it. By the way, the Comanche always took any Bibles they could find because they preferred to stuff their buffalo shields with the paper. Anyways, there was no doubt at all that this band of warriors were the ones that they were after. And as you can imagine, the Rangers were ready to deal out justice. As fictional Texas Ranger Augustus McCrae once said, "They don't know it yet, but the wrath of the Lord is about to descend on them." At daybreak, December 18th, 1860, the Rangers, Charlie Goodnight included, charged into the village, taking the Comanche completely by surprise. According to Captain Ross, the attack was so sudden that many of the Comanche were killed before they were even able to prepare to defend themselves. Most of the band was wiped out during this battle, including, according to some sources, Pete and Nakona. But this is debatable. Quona, who was able to escape the raid with his brother Peanuts, later said that his father wasn't killed, but he was out hunting when the attack took place. Captain Ross claims that he killed Nakona during the raid while he was attempting to flee with Cynthia Ann and their young daughter. And I discuss this more and go a lot more in depth on the Parker raid on my Quona Parker episode, which is episode 6. So check that out if you're interested in hearing more. Really fascinating history behind Quona, and I do talk a lot more about the evidence for and against whether or not his father was killed by the Rangers on that December morning. Of course, Cynthia Ann Parker was recaptured by the Texans and sent back against her will to her people back in civilized Texas. Her baby girl would die, and Cynthia Ann would eventually starve herself to death, mourning her husband, her children, and her adopted people. So this raid is a famous example of the type of early Texas Ranger work that Charles Goodnight would have participated in as a young man. He was primarily a cowman at this point, but when the call to arms is raised and the neighboring county was attacked, Charlie and other volunteers would mount up and travel fast and hard and try to retaliate. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they were able to retrieve captive children before too much harm was done. Once the Civil War broke out, Curitan's Rangers, including Goodnight, were attached to something called the Frontier Regiment. According to an article written by Robert Dunham, posted on the Texas State Historical Association website titled Frontier Regiment, this unit was a regiment of Rangers authorized by the 9th Legislature of Texas on December 21st, 1861, for the protection of the northern and western frontier of Texas. The act and the raising of the regiment was the state's political and military response to the vulnerabilities posed to the state's frontier settlements by the planned withdrawal and redeployment of the Confederate 1st Regiment Texas Mounted Riflemen from their frontier forts. And holy shit, that was a mouthful for me to read. Woo, okay, let's keep it going. Already withering Comanche and Kiowa Indian raids in 1861 were killing settlers, slaughtering livestock, and stealing horses in communities along the entire northern and western frontier. These settlements, substantively weakened by the mass exodus of their young men for service with the Confederacy in the Civil War, faced the grim prospect of continuing Indian depredations. So yeah, basically most every able-bodied fighting man of age was headed east to fight in the war between the states, leaving a shitload of defenseless women, children, and old people behind. Someone had to fill in the gap and somehow try to keep the wolves at bay. Hence the Frontier Regiment. During Charlie Goodnight's service in the regiment, he mostly did just that, spending the war pursuing hostile natives and bandits, ranging all over northern Texas, even heading as far north as present-day Colorado. It was during this time that he became intimately familiar with an area known as the Llano Estacado, also known as the Staked Plains. This was a stronghold of the Comanche Nation, and familiarity and knowledge of the area would prove very valuable to Goodnight in years to come. After Charlie's term of service was over in 1864, he returned to Palo Pinto County and tried to rebuild his cattle business. This was really the beginning of what we think of when we think the cowboy era, even though cattle had been raised in Texas going all the way back to the Spanish. Matter of fact, the Mexicans, contrary to what you may read or hear, were the original cowboys, known as Vaqueros. Many of the cowboy terms we all know come from these Vaqueros. Words like lasso, lariat, even the term buckaroo is an English bastardization of the word vaquero. At the end of the Civil War, the cattle in Texas were running wild as deer. And if you had the balls to go out there and gather a herd and drive it to market, the cattle were there for the taking. Speaking of the market, cattle wasn't worth anything in Texas. The market was saturated. So to make any profit, you had to deliver the cattle to where the demand was. Early on, back in the 1850s, this could mean driving cattle from Texas all the way to the cattle-starved California gold mines, a trip that would take as long as 6 months. And then, just prior to the start of the Civil War, when gold was discovered in Colorado, the same was true. Matter of fact, Oliver Loving delivered a herd of 1,500 head of cattle to Pueblo, Colorado in 1860. And then during the war, he was commissioned with supplying beef to the Confederate troops, driving cattle up the Mississippi River. After the war was over, people back east were hungry for beef. The Texans had a huge supply of said beef. Supply and motherfucking demand. This led to the creation of cattle towns, places like Abilene, Kansas, or Dodge City. These were railroad towns, and the closest shipping off point to the people back east. So you raised a herd, you got it branded, trailed it from Texas north to Kansas. You sold it, you got drunk, you banged a prostitute, got arrested, and then headed back to Texas. Rinse and repeat. Seriously though, this was hard work, dangerous work, and not for the weak or faint of heart. It took a strong constitution to be a cattleman in the mid to late 19th century, a constitution that Charlie Goodnight most definitely possessed. He and his partner Oliver Loving were also men of vision. They sought out where the demand was most high and provided a solution. When the Indian agencies in New Mexico were in need of beef, the pair organized a herd that left Fort Belknap, Texas, snaked its way across and along the Pecos, and up into New Mexico territory to Fort Sumner, where they sold their beeves for 8 cents a pound. 18 men took part in that first drive. You had Goodnight and Loving, obviously, and you had Bo Zacard, a former slave, a guy named One-Arm Bill Wilson because, well, he just had one arm, and he rounded off the crew with future notorious Texas gunman Clay Allison. The route they blazed would be known as the Goodnight Loving Trail, and will become one of the Southwest's most heavily used cattle trails, and not just to deliver cattle to New Mexico. The trail eventually extended up through Colorado to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Quick side note on Clay Allison. I did an episode on him as well, episode number 17. Just the mere fact that Goodnight could be a leader of men such as Allison says a lot, but you'll see that a lot in Goodnight's life. He's not very quick to be intimidated by other men, or shy about looking them in the eye. Okay, back to the Goodnight Loving Trail. Unfortunately, toward the end of the third trip up the trail, in 1867, Oliver Loving and One-Arm Bill Wilson were attacked by a war party of Comanche. I'm probably going to refer to Lonesome Dove a few times on this episode. If you're a new listener, check out episode 5 of Bloody Beaver Podcast, The Real Lonesome Dove. And if you have no idea what Lonesome Dove is, for shame. Lonesome Dove is an amazing book written by Larry McMurtry that was turned into an equally amazing made-for-TV movie starring Robert Duvall, Tommy Lee Jones, Danny Glover, Ricky Schroeder, Diane Lane, and many other great actors. The story follows 2 fictional ex-Texas Rangers turned cattlemen who organize and drive a herd from a little fart of a town in South Texas called Lonesome Dove all the way up to the Milk River region of northern Montana. Great story. My personal favorite nonfiction book of all time. Highly recommended. And if you're a fan of Lonesome Dove, you may or may not know that many of the people and events of the story are loosely based on real-life Texans, including Charlie Goodnight and Oliver Loving. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't read or seen Lonesome Dove, the death of Oliver Loving closely mirrors the death of a main character. If you have seen Lonesome Dove, then what I'm about to describe is going to sound awfully familiar. Oliver and One-Arm Bill were scouting far ahead of the herd when they were attacked. And like what happened in Lonesome Dove, they were being careless. At least Loving was. Goodnight had previously stressed to Loving the importance of traveling at night and laying low. And Loving did not do this. He was in a hurry, which led him getting spotted and attacked by those Comanche. He and Bill took shelter in a riverbank and held the hostiles off until nightfall. During the fight, they were both wounded, Loving having been shot twice but survived. He sent Wilson back to the herd for help, and he himself was able to escape under the cover of darkness, eventually finding himself in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. By this time, his wounds had become infected, and he developed gangrene in one of his arms. He may have yet still lived had the arm been amputated, but the only doctor at the fort had never done an amputation, and put it off until it was too late and the poison had already spread throughout Loving's body, headed towards his heart. By this point, Wilson had made the trek back to the herd, barefoot and delirious, and was able to tell Goodnight what had transpired. Charlie immediately struck out to find his friend. He located the scene of the battle and discovered Wilson's clothing and a rifle, but no Oliver Loving. He eventually located his friend there at Fort Sumner, where the man was dying. Loving asked if Goodnight would see to it that his body was brought back to Texas for burial, and Goodnight agreed. Sound familiar? If you've seen Lonesome Dove, hell yeah, it sounds familiar. And just like what happened in Lonesome Dove, Goodnight saw to it that his friend's body was hauled hundreds of miles back to Weatherford, Texas, where Lovin was buried in the Greenwood Cemetery. The story goes that Goodnight kept a picture of Lovin in his pocket long after his death, and even later still keeping a photo of his old friend on his work desk. Goodnight also continued to pay Lovin's family his share of profits from the cattle drives. One-armed Bill Wilson later said this about Lovin's death: "Thus ended the career of one of the best men I ever knew." Goodnight continued herding cattle to New Mexico during the late 1860s and also began driving cattle all the way to Colorado and Wyoming during this time, helping to stock up the northern herds. In 1869, Charlie established his Rock Canyon Ranch just south of Pueblo, Colorado, and then a year later he got hitched. 34-year-old Goodnight married Mary Ann Dyer, a Weatherford, Texas schoolteacher. The newlyweds made their home there in Colorado as Goodnight continued to herd cattle, even working with famed rancher John Chisholm in 1871 to clear a profit of a whopping $17,000. Over $350,000 in today's money. For a short time there, Goodnight prospered. He started investing heavily in the nearby town of Pueblo. He helped found a bank there as well as a meatpacking facility. Hell, he even became part owner of an opera house, getting all sophisticated and shit. He, along with neighboring cattlemen, formed Colorado's first stock raisers association. All that hard work was finally paying off. But then the Panic 1873, a financial crisis that triggered an economic depression in Europe and North America, along with overstocked ranges, resulted in Goodnight losing most of his holdings. Back to square one. He sent his wife away to relatives in California and worked on settling his affairs and getting back on his feet. In the fall of 1875, he took his remaining herd, just 1,600 head, and moved them to the Upper Canadian River in New Mexico for the winter while he scouted out land for a new ranch. He and a Mexican cowhand named Panchito, also known as Little Frank, started reconning the Texas Panhandle region, part of the area that Goodnight first saw as a Texas Ranger 15 years prior. He eventually settled on the Palo Duro Canyon as his new area of operations. This canyon, by the way, not far from present-day Amarillo, is the second largest canyon in the United States, second only to the Grand Canyon. And when Goodnight arrived, the area had just very recently been cleared of Native Americans. Long a stronghold of the Comanche, the natives had very recently voluntarily given up the Palo Duro Canyon just as a token of goodwill. Just a way of saying we appreciate our European conquerors, and let's just be BFFs from now on. Maybe sometime after the quarantine, we can hang out, and until then, let's just have really cool Zoom meetings. We can drink wine over Zoom, giggle, talk about guys. No, of course that's not what happened. Colonel Ronald McKenzie captured 1,200 Comanche horses and had them slaughtered in 1874 during the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. They also destroyed the natives' winter supplies. Without food or mounts, the Comanche could not survive the winter and were forced to retreat to the reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. This action effectively broke the backbone of the great Comanche nation. There were stragglers, but as a whole, the Indian wars in Texas were now over, leaving large amounts of land available for settlement. Goodnight returned to Pueblo to raise some money for his venture, headed back to New Mexico and remained with his men during calving season, and then, before heading to Palo Duro, met with Casimiro Romero, a former Comanchero and pioneer sheep rancher, and the two struck a deal. The pastores, or sheep herders in New Mexico, would limit their operations to the Canadian River and its tributaries, while Goodnight would have exclusive use of the headwaters and canyons of the Red River. This is a trend I started picking up while doing research on Goodnight. The man knew how to make deals and negotiate, especially with those that he may have previously considered enemies. I mean, hell, here he is working with a former Comanchero to divvy up land, just so there's no conflicts, trying to keep the peace and make sure there's no accidental misunderstandings. And soon he'd hire another former Comanchero named Nicholas Martinez to work for him. The Comancheros, if you're not familiar, made their living in the 18th and 19th century trading with the Great Plains tribes in northern New Mexico and West Texas, among other locales. But they traded mostly with the Comanche, hence the name Comancheros. The Comanche would bring in stolen livestock and slaves, and in return would get tools, flour, tobacco, clothes, shit like that. Many a poor child and a vacant-eyed woman were traded to the Comancheros, never to be seen again. So, needless to say, the Comancheros were a rough breed with less than questionable morals. But sometimes it's the devil you know, and Goodnight needed men who knew the country just as well as the Comanche did. And I think that's where guys like Nicholas Martinez come in. Kind of reminds me of Bolivar, the cook at the beginning of Lonesome Dove. He was an old Mexican bandit who got tired of being a bandit, found work cooking for the Hat Creek Boys. But old habits die hard, and every now and then, a stolen goat would end up on the dinner table. Goodnight, along with Panchito, Martinez, an Irishman named Dave McCormick, as well as others, descended into the Palo Duro Canyon to pick out a suitable place to build their headquarters. They also had to chase out the buffalo that were still residing in the canyon to make room for their cattle. In a short amount of time, Goodnight had a dugout constructed using abandoned Comanche lodge poles as rafters. And further southwest, he built a nicer 3-bedroom ranch house dubbed the Home Ranch, as well as corrals and a smokehouse. Goodnight left the crew there and headed to Los Animas, Colorado to pick up some much-needed supplies. On the way back, he met with the outlaw Dutch Henry Bourne and his gang. The men had a parley and came to an agreement, sealed with a drink of whiskey. Much like the agreement Goodnight made with the sheep herder Romero, Dutch Bourne agreed to keep his illegal activities north of the Salt Fork of the Red River. And he kept his word. Probably no small part being due to Goodnight's reputation. If he could track down the Comanche, he could damn well track down their trifling outlaw-looking asses. Goodnight checked in on the home ranch, found everything working to his liking, and headed off for Colorado once again. This time to secure more money, as well as making arrangements for his wife to join him at the canyon. While in the CO, that's what I call Colorado sometimes, he met up with John G. Adair, a money man, whom Goodnight had already borrowed $30,000 from. Adair agreed to loan Goodnight more money so he could expand the ranch, and then in June of 1877, they drew up a 5-year contract launching the J.A. Ranch, in which Goodnight would continue to reside as manager, retain a third of the financial interest, as well as a yearly salary of $2,500. And that's not too bad. That's about $61,000 in today's money. Goodnight would spend the next 11 years in this role, building the herd, expanding the range, as well as doing what he'd done for so long, keeping law and order in the Panhandle region of Texas. Sometimes just the mere presence of men like Charles Goodnight is enough to cause people to mind their damn manners. But sometimes he had to take action. There was a certain occasion that Goodnight's wife expressed shock at some vigilante hangings. "I understand," she exclaimed, "that they hanged them from a telegraph pole." Charlie quietly replied that he didn't think it hurt the telegraph pole, but what he was probably thinking was, LOL, fuck them hoes. What she didn't know, what he wisely kept to himself, was that the victims had actually been strung up with Goodnight's full approval. The men that were hung were caught in the act of murder and cattle rustling. You know how it goes, Jake. Ride with an outlaw, die with an outlaw. In the summer of 1878, Goodnight took the first of the J.A.'s herds to market, led by the lead steer Old Blue, all the way from Palo Duro to Dodge City, Kansas. And doing so, he blazed yet another trail that would be used for years to come by cattlemen, this one known as the Palo Duro Dodge City Trail. In the fall of 78, Goodnight received some unannounced visitors at the J.A. Ranch. They consisted of Comanche War Chief Quanah Parker, the son of Pina Nakona and Cynthia Ann Parker that we mentioned earlier, along with a decent group of Comanche and Kiowa. These natives, led by Quanah, had received permission to leave the reservation in search of buffalo, unsupervised. Once again, they rode the vast plains as their ancestors had, as they had as children and young men. They'd find and kill the buffalo using the gallbladder to season the raw liver, drink the warm milk from the udders of the cows, and maybe, just maybe, feel a little bit of that glory they felt back in the old days. But sadly, that wasn't to be. The buffalo were gone. So instead of returning to the reservation, they pushed deeper, finally pushed into their old stronghold, the Palo Duro Canyon. And not only did they not find any buffalo, but they found a damn white man was in charge of the land that they once owned just 3 years prior. But Quanah said fuck it, they started killing Goodnight's cattle. And Charles Goodnight, being the man that he is, rode out to meet his visitors face to face. He'd fought the Comanche many times before. He killed them and they tried to kill him. Hell, they killed his friend Oliver Lovin. Those were the old days. The times had changed. I like to think it went down like that scene in The Outlaw Josie Wells, when Clint Eastwood rode out to meet with 10 bears. You know the speech. I came here to die with you or live with you. Dying ain't so hard for men like you and me. It's living that's hard, when all you've ever cared about has been butchered or raped. Governments don't live together, people live together. With governments, you don't always get a fair word or a fair fight. Well, I've come here to give you either one, or get either one from you. I came here like this so you'll know my word of death is true, and my word of life is then true. Eastwood then goes on to say, I ain't promising you nothing extra. I'm just giving you life and you're giving me life. And I'm saying that men can live together without butchering one another. A very poignant message, considering our current news cycle. In reality, I doubt the conversation between Goodnight or Quanah went quite like that. But it wasn't too far off the mark, and the sentiment rings true. The Comanche and Texans didn't have to keep on killing each other. And Goodnight, just like Josie Wells, rode out and met with Quanah face to face, letting him know that there is iron in his words. During the parley, the Comanche asked Goodnight what the fuck he was doing on their land. You know, the lack of buffalo had them more than a little pissed off. Goodnight replied that he was raising cattle, to which the Comanche asked if he did not know that this was their country, not his. Goodnight said that he heard they claimed the country, but that the great captain of Texas also claimed it. During this convo, Charlie asked Quanah what his name was. Quanah's answer in broken English, maybe so 2 names, Mr. Parker and Quanah. He then told Goodnight that he was ready to talk business. Man, I'd love to have been there. Both intelligent leaders of men, both recognizing the real in each other, both knowing they had to remain strong. Quanah still with the pride of a free Comanche, the survival of his people weighing heavy on his shoulders. Goodnight with the responsibility of running a ranch as well as the lives of his men on the line. Supposedly, Quanah asked Goodnight, what have you got? You know, he wanted payment. He didn't want to leave the Palo Duro Canyon with nothing but his dick in his hand. Goodnight responded by telling Quanah that he has plenty of guns and bullets. I've got good men who are good shots, but I don't want to fight unless you force me. You keep order and behave yourself, and I will give you 2 beeves every other day until you find out where the buffalo are. Quanah agreed, and the deal was sealed. A few days later, 25 buffalo soldiers showed up to deal with the, quote, Indian threat, but Goodnight assured them that the problem had been solved. Nothing to see here, officer. The entire time the Comanche stayed camped there, both sides held up their end of the bargain. The natives didn't cause any trouble, and Goodnight supplied them with beef. By the way, Quanah and Goodnight would go on to become friends. Charlie would end up gifting Quanah a prime Durham bull for breeding purposes later on, to help him grow a herd of his own. And once Quanah Parker grew to prominence and had his famous Star House built, Goodnight would eat dinner there and visit the old Comanche warrior on occasion. Back at the JA Ranch, Goodnight kept on doing his thug thing. In 1880, he helped organize the Panhandle Stock Association, as well as serving as its first president. A couple years later, he bought the Lazy F Ranch and became the first Panhandle rancher to start using that fancy newfangled barbed wire. Things were going well, but tensions were strained at times with the majority JA Ranch holder, John Adair. Goodnight found his arrogant mannerisms tiring. But mostly thanks to Goodnight's warm relationship with Adair's wife, his contract was renewed and his annual salary was increased to $7,500 a year. According to the Texas State Historical Association, by the time of Adair's death in 1885, the JA had reached its maximum of 1,325,000 acres, on which grazed more than 100,000 head of Goodnight's carefully bred cattle. In addition, Goodnight was a pioneer in the use of artificial watering facilities and the ownership of permanent ranges in fee. As an early believer in improvement through breeding, he developed one of the nation's finest herds through the introduction of Hereford bulls. He often spent weeks at a time at the stockyards in Kansas City, buying and selling cattle to upgrade his herds. With his wife's encouragement, he also started a domestic buffalo herd, sired by an old bully named Old Sykes, from which he developed the cattle loaf from crossing bison with Angus cattle. He also invented the first practical side saddle, with an additional horn to rest the left knee for his wife. Fucking Charles Goodnight, always on the go, always working, always making plays, always expanding. You weren't going to catch him sitting around playing with adult coloring books, or making videos for TikTok. By the way, Goodnight also was credited with inventing the Chuck Wagon. In 1886, Charlie began investing in the Interstate Land Company, selling shares of land for him on the Texas-New Mexico border that had been purchased from an old Spanish land grant. He also got involved in a little something called the grass lease fight. And trust me, it was nowhere near as exciting as it sounds. There was no gunfire or vigilante night rides in the grass lease fight. This was a fight that was duked out in courtrooms and newspaper editorials. Basically, it was about the large cattle operations, guys like Goodnight taking up too much of the public domain for their operations. Fencing off land that didn't belong to them, that was supposed to be available to others, and, not wanting to yield to the free grazers. Yada, yada, yada. You've heard it before. Temple Houston, son of former Texas President Sam Houston, and Goodnight were often at odds during this time. And in this case, the cattlemen were wrong. They couldn't own it all, and laws were passed to see to it that they wouldn't. Goodnight especially was dragged through the press during this debacle and accused of stealing money from the school children of Texas. He'd eventually come around, though, accepting the progress of the times and declaring that, quote, nothing will ruin us that settles the country. And it wasn't just the farmers and the railroads and the new laws infiltrating the Panhandle that was affecting Charlie. There was also a recent drought and plummeting beef prices, as well as a painful stomach ailment that almost took him under. With all this shit going on, he had to back away, selling his interest in the JA Ranch after his contract was over in 1887. Goodnight then bought 160 sections in Armstrong County, just barely southeast of Amarillo. These sections were right along the railroad, and it was here, near the town that still bears his name, Goodnight, Texas, that Charlie built a 2-story ranch house and relocated his buffalo herd. A few years later, in 1890, a 54-year-old Charlie invested heavily in a gold and silver mining operation deep in the heart of Chihuahua, Mexico. And it proved to be a failure. Man, it's starting to seem like whenever Charlie stuck to what he knew, he did well. But when he branched out, that's when he would start losing money. When things were good, he was kind of rich, in the sense that he had land and a shitload of cattle. But all it takes is one bad winter or a bad drought to wreak havoc on a ranch. Or in this case, a financial crisis. And I have no doubt that there were plenty of investors and bankers constantly knocking on Goodnight's door, telling him all about the new surefire investment that he just had to get into. According to Cornelia Adair, Charlie lacked good business sense. But still, when he was able to, he gave back to the community. In 1898, he and his wife opened up the Goodnight College there in Goodnight, Texas. They also established something called the Goodnight Academy, offering post-elementary education to hundreds of children of ranchers. And then by 1900, he had reduced most of his land holdings to just 60 sections around his house. It was there that he continued raising and experimenting with buffalo, as well as raising elk, antelope, and other animals. And as a Texan, I feel like I can say this. What a fucking Texan thing to do. I'm pretty sure we're the state with more high-fence exotic operations than any other in the country. Easily. I feel like if Charlie was around nowadays, he'd probably own several hundred tigers as well. He'd show that bitch Carol Baskin who the real king of the jungle is. I'll tell you that much. And just a side note, but on our little storyline here, we're in the year 1900. I'm always fascinated by this time period when it comes to guys like Charlie. When the clock inched towards midnight on the night of 1899, all those Wild West guys didn't just magically fade away. They were still there, in the background. The ones that survived, at least. Trying to figure out how to adapt to an ever-changing world. How surreal it must have been for Goodnight to go from his early 20s chasing wild Comanche, feeling the arrows whiz past and smelling the black powder smoke, being one of the first white men to ever really get to know the Llano Estacado, pioneering those early cattle drives, delivering herds to those wild cow towns like Abilene and Dodge City, surely brushing up shoulder to shoulder at a saloon with deadly gunmen, men who'd shoot you if they didn't like the way you took off your hat. Yet somehow he pretty much took off his hat as he pleased, and he survived. No dramatics, nothing fancy, just hard work and determination. And then to reach his 60s and see that once wild land populated by towns and railroads and telegraphs, and knowing that he was responsible for it, men like him. You know, if it weren't for guys like him, those first ranchers and pioneers pushed into the wilderness and carving out a place for respectable folks, that land would have never got settled. Men like Goodnight with rough hands that knew how to wield both rifle and plow paved the way for all the self-righteous gentlemen to come. Men, to quote Steve Earle, whose only worth is their father's name and the sweat of a working man. Got to imagine it kind of stuck in Goodnight's craws just a little. You know, surely he had more trust in those Comancheros or the outlaw Dutch-born, and later that deal he made with Quona, than he ever did with any of the soft-handed investors or bankers he worked with. Those deals with the old breed were sealed with a handshake or a drink, and they were adhered to, because they were deals agreed upon amongst men. The deals he'd later make with money were done with weasels, whimpering little simps who worked their thievery with a pen and a court of law. Men who've never felt the exhaustion of a real honest day's worth of work. But still, all that aside, Goodnight was a man of progress. Times were a-changing, and he was changing with them. He wasn't one just to sit at the Old West version of the VFW, day drink, and tell stories about the good old days. Nah, he had shit to do. Around this same time, his ranch there in the Panhandle became a major tourist attraction, as well as a place to stop and get a nice tasty buffalo steak. Goodnight staged buffalo hunts for his friend Quona Parker, as well as other native leaders and their people in Oklahoma. He even saw to it that the Pueblo Nation in New Mexico were given a foundation herd of buffalo, as well as petitioning on their behalf to Congress. Speaking of Goodnight's buffalo herd, they got sent all over. Some of the bison were sent to zoos in places like New York and England. Even Canada and Germany got in on that sweet buffalo action. Others were shipped out to replenish Yellowstone. His preservation efforts eventually caught the eyes of naturalists, guys like William T. Hornady. He originally only captured those first buffalo at the urgings of his wife. And sometimes that's what us guys need, a good woman to let us know the right path to take. By 1888, that herd had grown to 13 head. 5 years later, he had 25 to 30 head, and many more half-breeds. By January 1st, 1914, Mr. Goodnight's herd consisted of 164 buffalo. Not only was this one of the largest privately held herds of buffalo, but it was unique in that they all originated as the last of the great southern herd. It was ranchers like Goodnight who really helped the buffalo not go extinct altogether. If you're really interested in this topic, I highly recommend reading Stephen Ranella's book, American Buffalo, In Search of a Lost Icon. And on top of all this, Charlie started conducting agricultural experiments. He established the first large-scale marijuana grow operation in North Texas from a strain of Mexican cannabis locals dubbed Loca Mota. This, of course, caused Goodnight to also invest in a local Little Debbie's factory to compensate for the late-night munchies he was now prone to. And nah, I made all that up. Unfortunately, Goodnight never got into the marijuana business. Wish he had, though. Maybe that should be legal in Texas by now. What he did get involved in was wheat. W-H-E-A-T. He worked with botanist Luther Burbank and grew the first wheat crop there in Armstrong County. Charlie and his wife Marianne never had any children of their own, but they never lacked a full house. They often put up college students at the ranch, and they employed a housekeeper who had a son that they basically raised as their own, a kid named Cleo Hubbard. And then sadly, in 1926, Goodnight's wife, Marianne, who he called Molly, and who others called the mother of the Panhandle, passed away at the age of 86. The couple had been married for 56 years. Shortly after Molly's death, Charlie himself fell seriously ill, but was nursed back to health by a young lady and telegraph operator from Butte, Montana, named Corinne Goodnight. The two had gotten to know each other due to sharing an uncommon last name and had been corresponding for some time. And then, to celebrate his 91st birthday, Charlie married Corinne in May of 1927. She was 26 years old and about to find out the true meaning behind the saying, the older the violin, the sweeter the music, if you know what I mean. Charlie might not have been as good as he once was, but I have no doubt on the night of their wedding that he was as good once as he ever was. Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. All jokes aside, when I think of old man Charlie Goodnight, I think of John Wayne in that movie The Cowboys, before he got into it with that damn outlaw who told him he was a pretty old man. He replied, yep, 30 years older than you are, had my back broke once and my hip twice, and on my worst day I can beat the hell out of you, which he commenced to do. Obviously, Charlie wasn't beating anybody's ass in his 90s, other than that of Corinne's, if you know what I'm saying, but I imagine those fists were still hard as iron, and he likely could put most younger men to shame. There's no denying it, though. Charlie was getting old. To once again very loosely quote Larry McMurtry's Streets of Laredo, Charlie had his time. It was a long time, too. Life's but a knife's edge. Sooner or later, people slip and get cut. And if you think about it, we're all on our way out. So, act accordingly. Goodnight and his young bride sold their ranch in Armstrong County with the stipulation that he'd be allowed to live there until his death and bought a summer house in Clarendon, Texas. He also began spending winters in Arizona due to health reasons. While in Arizona, he was often driven around in a 1925 Packard, where he complained that the local ranchers didn't care for their cattle good enough. Charlie observed the cows trying to get to the green grass underneath the cactus, and while doing so, get cactus stickers in their noses. He'd then walk out despite being in his 90s and pull the stickers out. In these last twilight years of his life, he gave many interviews to Western authors, journalists, and historians. As well as he should have, the man was a living, breathing page straight out of the Wild West history books. And just a side note, It always amazes me how we ignore the old people out there. You know, the ones sitting quietly alone in nursing homes with the most interesting stories to tell if only somebody would just sit down and talk to them. 16 million Americans served during the Second World War, where there's only about 300,000 or so still left alive today. And they're dying off at an average of 245 per day. In another 20 years, they'll all be gone. And with them, their stories. If you're still blessed to have a grandparent or a great-grandparent alive, sit down and interview them and record it. Ask them about their lives, their parents, their grandparents. Ask them what they thought about all the historical events they lived through. You know, where were you when JFK was assassinated? What did you think when you watched the moon landing? Who was the first president you voted for? What's your first memory? You'll never regret doing this, trust me. And you'll keep their legacy alive for long after they're gone. Anyway, back to Charlie Goodnight. Even though he had paid for and built several churches over the years, he never actually joined one until July of 1929. Maybe something about being in your 90s that I can only imagine makes a man start contemplating where his soul is going to spend eternity. At one point, he was asked what church he affiliated himself with, and replied, "I don't know, but it's a damn good one." When he was baptized, 2 younger men stood at his side to help him out of the water. But he brushed them off, saying, "I'd rather go out unassisted," which he did. And then, on the morning of December 12th, 1929, Charles Goodnight, the father of the Panhandle, passed away at his winter home in Arizona. He was 93 years old and buried next to his first wife, Molly, at the Goodnight Cemetery there in Goodnight, Texas. And Charlie's legacy lives on. Like I said, much of Lonesome Dove took stories straight out of Goodnight's actual life. That gravestone that Woodrow carved out for Dietz, Charlie did the same for a man named Beau Zicard, a former slave who was one of Goodnight's top hands. Zicard's gravestone reads, "Beau Zicard served with me 4 years on the Goodnight Loving Trail. Never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order. Rode with me in many stampedes. Participated in 3 engagements with Comanches. Splendid behavior." Goodnight didn't give a damn that Bose was a black man, just like he didn't give a damn about working next to Mexicans or helping out the defeated Native Americans. All he cared about was that a man was a man, willing to share in the hard work and danger, never shirking their duty. And his own life was lived in such a manner, never asking of others what he himself wasn't willing to do. And make no mistake about it, he could be a stern taskmaster. He's described by historian William T. Hagen as a, quote, demanding boss, approaching every task himself with all the energy he could muster, and he expected the same from those under his direction. Whatever tasks were pending, Goodnight thought that he was able to do it better than his hands, and he usually could. And even though he was known to use profanity and have a sip of whiskey on occasion, he would not hesitate to fire anybody in his employ that he caught drinking, fighting, gambling, or abusing horses. Anytime I start thinking about men like Goodnight, those tough old breed of cowboys and ranchers, I'm reminded of the Johnny Cash song, "Bury Me Not." It's really more of a prayer than a song. The type of prayer that, if not recited by Goodnight, was certainly felt in the stirrings of his heart. And it does end on a bit of a morbid note, lest we get taken away and start romanticizing that life. It was hard and deadly and only for the strong. But as Charlie reflected on his life there towards the end, he was quoted as saying, "Taken all in all, my life on the trail was the happiest part of it." The lyrics to Bury Me Not go like this. "Lord, I've never lived where churches grow. I love creation better as it stood. That day you finished it so long ago and looked upon your work and called it good. I know that others find you in the light that sifted down through tinted window panes. And yet I seem to feel you here tonight in this dim, quiet starlight on the plains. I thank you, Lord, that I'm placed so well, that you've made my freedom so complete, that I'm no slave to whistle, clock, or bell, nor weak-eyed prisoner of wall or street. Just let me live my life as I've begun. Give me work that's open to the sky. Make me a partner of the wind and sun, and I won't ask a life that's soft or high. Let me be easy on the man that's down. Let me be square and generous with all. I'm careless sometimes, Lord, when I'm in town, but never let them say I'm mean or small. Make me as big and open as the plains, and honest as the horse between my knees, clean as the wind that blows behind the reins, free as the hawk that circles down the breeze. Forgive me, Lord, sometimes if I forget. You know the reasons that are hid. You understand the things that gall or fret. You know me better than my mother did. Just keep an eye on all that's done and said, and right me sometimes when I turn aside, and guide me on that long, dim trail ahead that stretches upward toward the great divide. Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie." These words came low and mournfully from the pallid lips of a youth who lay on his dying bed at the close of day. Oh, bury me not, and his voice fell there, but we took no heed to his dying prayer. In a shallow grave, just 6 by 3, we buried him there on the lone prairie. Charlie Goodnight no doubt buried more than a few rangers, cowboys, and settlers in a shallow grave on the lone prairie himself. But he also, as the song goes, was easy on the man who was down, square and generous with all. In none of the research I've done on Goodnight have I found anything suggesting that he was some sort of money-hungry cattle baron or that he ever forgot where he came from, his humble beginnings. Monty Gooden, a member of the museum board who was born in the Goodnight house in 1931, just 2 years after Goodnight's death, has said that Goodnight had no concept of his own importance. It didn't matter who you were. He invited all in. Historian and author J. Frank Dobie, who actually personally knew Goodnight, had this to say about the man. I have met a lot of good men, several fine gentlemen, hordes of cunning climbers, plenty of loud brain asses, and plenty of dumb oxen. But I haven't lived long enough or traveled far enough to meet more than 2 or 3 men I'd call great. This is a word I will not bandy around. To me, Charlie Goodnight was great-natured. You can visit Goodnight's grave if you're ever up near Amarillo, but if you do and want to pay your respects, you might want to bring an old bandana with you. It's my understanding that his grave is adorned by bandanas that visitors leave, honoring the old cattleman. Remember Charlie's stepdad and sister? The pair ended up getting married and having several children, but Goodnight never saw his sister again. He even refused to ever speak her name. Mary Jane's children grew up hearing about their legendary uncle, but only 2 of them, 2 teenage boys, hungry to meet their famous relative, ever dared knock on the old man's door. According to one of Mary Jane's descendants, Goodnight received them politely, but not warmly, before sending them on their way. And they reportedly never bothered him again. So yeah, obviously this was not a fond childhood memory for Charlie Goodnight. Corinne Goodnight, his much younger second wife, would survive him for another 42 years, passing away in 1971. Fucking 1971, that's like yesterday. If you're listening to this and you're over the age of 50, you were living and breathing at the same time as somebody who was married to a man who fought wild Comanche. That shit will never not be fascinating to me. I couldn't find out too much about Corinne's life after Charlie's death. I did find out there's a diary of hers from 1927 that supposedly describes her marriage to Charles, the status of his health, as well as her own during her pregnancy and other daily events. But I couldn't find it online. I just know that it can be located at the Briscoe Center for American History in Austin, Texas. So now I'm curious, did Goodnight get her pregnant in his old age, but maybe she lost a child? I don't know. It's also unclear whether or not she ever got married again. So that's about all I've got on Charles Goodnight. Thanks for listening, y'all. If you just discovered my podcast, do me a huge favor and go ahead and subscribe. And if you really want to get all funky monkey with it, go ahead and subscribe on YouTube as well. As far as updates go, I've got a few corrections to make. Evidently, in the Great Northfield Raid episode, I said that Missouri was not a Confederate state. Looks like I was wrong about this. Kind of. I am often wrong about many, many things. So please never feel shy to call me out if I get something wrong. The governor of Missouri and his secessionist supporters enacted an ordinance of secession in 1861, and they were admitted into the Confederacy. However, the Union supporters of Missouri failed to accept the legal status of their secession, and the state continued to be divided. Unlike a lot of the Confederate states, Missouri was never under total control of the Confederacy. The secessionist government there actually had to flee in exile to Texas, where they set up camp. So yes, thank you, Joe B., for making that correction. Yes, Missouri was technically part of the Confederate States of America, but still, like I said, a very divided and contested state, as opposed to, say, Georgia or Alabama. Also, that same episode, it looks like I gave the wrong date for the Northfield Raid. Charles Tripp pointed out that I say at the beginning it happened in December of 1876, when in reality it occurred in September. So thank you, Charles, for pointing that out. I recently started a Twitter account for Bloody Beaver Podcast where I can post pictures of some of these guys and gals we talk about. So you can find me there at Bloody Beaver Pod. It's a work in progress, but I'm trying to add new pictures as I find the time. Also, still getting a lot of feedback and comments on my old episode I did on Brushy Bill Roberts way back in the day. This remains my most downloaded episode, and I had no idea it'd be so controversial. A lot of people really, really love the idea of Brushy Bill being Billy the Kid, and they also really, really hate me for shitting all over that idea. So I'm toying around with the idea of making a Brushy Bill Part 2 episode where I can address some of the comments and questions I've gotten over the subject. I'm still rocking out with my cock out on Patreon. Not literally, but with my ongoing series on the life of Kit Carson. Having a lot of fun researching that guy. Kit lived one hell of a fascinating life. As of this recording, there are 6 episodes in the Kit Carson series available for subscribers, with a new one released each and every Monday morning at 6 a.m. Central. Episode number 1 on the Kit Carson series is available for the public, so if you want to check it out for free, head over to Patreon and give it a go. That is www.patreon.com/Bloody Beaver, or do a search for Bloody Beaver on the Patreon search engine. Also on Patreon, you can find the first ever episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast I did on Hugh Glass back in the day, and that episode can only be found on Patreon. It's pretty damn bad, so only give that one a listen if you really want to make your ears bleed. Okay, 2 more quick updates. Bloody Beaver Podcast now has a new logo. If you haven't seen it already, I posted it on Twitter at Bloody Beaver Pod, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Thinking about maybe getting some coffee mugs or stickers made, if there's any demand for it. If you're interested, just hit me up. Last update. Hopefully you're noticing a better quality of audio with this episode. And for that, you can thank Dan, the motherfucking audio man. Ever since I first started this podcast, I've struggled with the sound quality. Even after I got a new microphone, and even after countless hours of watching YouTube tutorials and trying to figure out what the hell stuff like equalization and compression and normalization means, I still can't get this shit right. Finally decided I needed to reach out to a professional, and that's where Dan comes in. I'm still doing the bulk of the editing, but Dan's working his magic, making the sound a little clearer, crisper, hopefully getting rid of some of my hard S's. Hopefully taking some of the Down syndrome out of my voice, getting those magical compression and EQ levels just right. Dan hosts his own podcast as well that you can find on Apple Podcasts called Heroes of Noise. He and his co-host Steve do a weekly show focusing on pop culture, current events, movies, TV, music, comics, the complexities of differing shapes and colors of various penis types. What's better, circumcised or uncircumcised? What nationalities have the, quote, best penises? And you get the picture. Lots of penis talk over there on Heroes of Noise. No, I'm just kidding. As far as I know, there's no penis parties going on over there. Or maybe there is. If that's your thing, go check them out. Bloody Beaver Podcast is a judgment-free zone where everybody is welcome. So thank you to Dan for helping me out and making me sound just a little less cringy. And if any of y'all are looking for some editing or audio help, or you know anybody that is, Dan can be reached at podcasteditor72@gmail.com. And as always, feel free to contact me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com with whatever's going on in that crazy little head of yours. Comments, suggestions, complaints, they're all welcome. Let me know what y'all think of the new logo, damn it. One more time, bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. And please fucking follow me on Twitter @bloodybeaverpod. Okay? I have like 0 followers over there, so I'm feeling kind of like a loser right now. Throw a dog a bone, motherfucker. And don't forget about Patreon either. Patreon.com/bloodybeaver. So that's all for this week. Hope I did Charles Goodnight justice. And I hope I can be a little bit more like him, doing what I got to do to make shit happen, instead of sitting around hoping things will just take care of themselves. All right, y'all can go ahead and pull your pants back up. Feel free to break eye contact, and I will see y'all next episode. Till then, stay black.